Good afternoon, Peter Bleksley. How are you?
Good afternoon on this tragic, sad day.
Not the way that we thought that we'd have our first link, you and I. Listen, I was listening and watching Mike this morning, and you hear about this. Without wanting to jump on any sort of bandwagon, Pete, this is happening more and more. This is a man running around this morning, I should say. I mean, you can see the pictures, with a knife, a sword, attacking, you know, emergency services, having murdered a 14-year-old boy. How and why, in the name of God, is Britain so broken, Peter Bleksley?
There is a huge issue with the amount of weapons being taken out onto the streets of Britain. This is borne out clearly by ghastly events like today.
Yep.
Many, many other cases that we could talk about, and the statistics which show that knife crime is undoubtedly and sadly on the rise.
Why?
Well, it's a very complex issue. We are used, tragically, to teenagers being murdered so often by fellow teenagers. That in itself is a problem. And many learned academics will put up reasons about a lack of parenting, poverty, exclusion from school and the such like. But from a former detective's perspective, and of course a former uniformed cop, which I was a long time ago, I like to focus on the aspects that the police could tackle. And the harsh reality is that there is not a visible patrolling presence of police on the streets these days.
Absolutely right.
Our frontline response officers are going from one emergency call to another emergency call. Neighbourhood community policing, call it what you will, has been decimated in recent years.
We've talked about this as well. Surely the whole idea of cops is intel on the streets. By being on the streets, you find out what's going on the streets and you pass that down or up the line. But if you're coppers, I mean, I've told you this story before and people look at me like I've landed from Mars. A friend whose dad was a cop for 30 years and he just gave up out of the blue. He was just a cop on the beat. Because he said in the old days you go round to a lady who'd been burgled or, you know, attacked, and you'd spend hours. You know, you'd make sure she was fine. Nowadays it's all about box ticking and filling out your computerised form and moving on. He'd stay around and put a new lock on the door. He'd do absolutely everything for her. That doesn't happen now. That says so little about where we're at. So, you know, without getting political, more coppers on the streets. Why not?
Well, I hope people don't think that I'm being trite here, because I'm not. But so much about modern policing, the demands from up on high are that it has to be measurable. You have to measure the effectiveness of what the police are doing.
The effectiveness or the effect it might have on the perpetrator of the crime rather than the goddamn victim. That's where I think we've gone wrong.
The effectiveness, unfortunately, because any aspiring senior officer, if they can't show some degree of improvement on a spreadsheet, then, of course, they're not going to get the next rank.
I'll tell you what we'll do. You're with us for a while, and I appreciate it. Let's go to Will Hobbs, Talks reporter who has been at the scene in Hainault this afternoon and this morning for us. Will, can you just bring us up to date, my friend, that tragic news earlier that a 14-year-old boy has indeed lost his life? What's the very latest, Will?
Yeah, that's right, Jeremy. We're due to have another police statement imminently, and Wes Streeting, the local MP for North Ilford, is to be coming and delivering a statement as well. As you said, a 14-year-old boy tragically losing his life. We had eyewitnesses saying that the knife resembled a samurai sword and that multiple police jumped on the suspect. As we know, 2 police officers are in hospital requiring surgery and 2 civilians as well with non-life-threatening injuries. I think the alarming thing for a lot of locals here today who I've spoken to is that currently there appears to be absolutely no link between the suspect and the victims. There doesn't seem to have been a targeted attack, but also, I suppose, there is also no threat. The police say there is no hint of terrorism, but it does disturb the locals. That the tragic incident took place in the first place, the nature of the knife, the nature of the attacker, and also that it's seemingly at this stage a random attack.
Will, thank you for now. Pete, can I bring you back in? We've thrown this out as many times as I can count on my fingers and toes. Is Britain safe anymore? Are the streets safe? In fact, if you're listening and you're watching, we'd love your view. What do you think? 0344 499 1000 and text to 87222. Start your message with the word talk. Pete, your average Briton will say, no, it's not. And that, to me, I know I'm 60 next year and I'm an old fossil, but if the law felt you can't, I was scared of the police. Are the police a laughing stock? What's happened, man?
Policing has changed dramatically in the last 20, 25 years or so. And of course, we've seen that in the name of the Met, for example, which went from the Metropolitan Police Force to the Metropolitan Police Service. And what the police in many
because the word
regards-
force was too disrespectful?
Oh, it was too frightening, too scary, and it had too many connotations to some of the bad elements of policing of yesteryear, which I've spoken about a lot around in the past. Now it is a service to a large degree, a social service. And because response frontline police officers do not patrol, because neighbourhood policing has been decimated, there is a lack of connection with communities. And that whole prospect of committing a crime, running round the corner and bumping into a police officer simply does not exist. So broadly, what's happened? The streets have been surrendered. There is more criminality.
When you say that, though, just because you and I will be accused of over-egging this, but if you are tuning in, just think about that. A 14-year-old kid gets up this morning to get on with his day. He's in a morgue this afternoon. I mean, stabbed to death by a 36-year-old, I'm going to say maniac, we don't know, with a samurai sword. No police officers, presumably not their fault. Maybe there'll be a story, apparently not terrorist, but it could be a personal story or that. But no intel, nothing. I mean, it gets to a point where, and this is perhaps, I said this to my wife earlier, Peter, maybe this is the worst thing I should say, but it's how I feel. You're not even surprised anymore, man. That's what I find so upsetting and shocking.
And when we're not surprised, the next step is not to be necessarily outraged or concerned. And I think this is a huge problem, not only within policing, but within society. And I hope people will grant me some forgiveness as I relay a story from many years ago. When we had what were called home beat officers back in the day, when I was a rookie cop and I looked up to those officers, if they came into work in the morning and saw that a burglary had happened on their beat, on their patch, they would be incandescent with rage. And I, as a young police officer, grew up to be outraged by crime.
Because that was your patch.
And to quite frankly say, hate criminals. And to this day, I hate criminals. I hate people who commit crime and create victims. But of course, a modern police officer couldn't say that. He couldn't walk into a police station and say, I hate criminals.
Why?
Because they would suddenly be accused of all manner of inappropriate behaviour.
So we become soft. The police, in trying to be all things to all people, have become too soft.
Those two police officers who require surgery as a result of heroically trying to intervene and detain this man today are not soft. They're heroes and shall remain so forever and a day, like the other officers that went there and detained him. So those individual officers are far from soft, but I fear that unless policing, British policing, grows a spine and becomes a model of what people want from policing, which is patrolling the streets.
But that's the point. Can I jump in? It's a really interesting point when you say what people want. We now live in a world where we are told, you know, all the police need to have a chat with you. I mean, in Scotland, for God's sake, if you call somebody a name, you're arrested, but you can go and do, I mean, that Isla Bryson thing, we talked about it yesterday. A man rapes 2 women, decides to become a woman and is put in a female prison. To me, the priorities are wrong, and it's not good if you're... Of course the police should be, I think, viewed as people that you don't want to upset. But no, that's gone. I have sympathy, and I'll be honest with you, for many hundreds and thousands of policemen and women who are working within the confines of how it's laid out by the chiefs of whichever force they're in. But for me, unless policing becomes more obvious, more apparent, more on the streets, more intel-based, and unless the punishment, you know, is allied to the crime, where do we end up? I mean, we used to watch programmes about other countries, oh, the police are nothing and crooks and gangs are running amok. If you read the newspapers or you watch the news in this country, there are many days, like today after this horror in Hainault, where you go, the same's happening in Great Britain, and it's only going to get worse.
We end up where we are today, and it can only get worse. As we speak and sit here, somebody will be in a store filling up a bag and walking out without paying for it. Shoplifting.
But you can't complain to the police if it's less than 200 quid because they'll be too busy doing something like the Macarena. Listen, it's 4:15. Bleksley, Mr. Bleksley, don't go anywhere.